This video is brought to you by SquareSpace. Why on earth would you spend an extra $200 on the X30 when, at a glance, it appears to offer less? This is precisely the kind of question you'll be asking yourself if you put the spec sheet of both the X30 and the G60 side by side. But as always, the answer to this question is much more complex. You know, because just reading out a spec sheet and coming up to definitive conclusions definitely isn't the smart thing to do. So why does the G60 cost around $300 while the X30 costs over $500? Let's take a deeper dive in order to understand which one will suit you better. But first, here's a word from today's video sponsor. Let's face it, we all thought at least once about starting our own website online. Whether it's to showcase our passions to the world or to build an online business. And SquareSpace makes this very simple. With SquareSpace, you can build your own website with ease thanks to their excellent custom templates. It's taken me less than an hour to build a site from scratch into something that I'm fairly proud of. I also love how easy it is to build an online store, whether you're planning on selling a physical or a digital good or creating something unique for your community. And once you're ready to go live, SquareSpace also provides the perfect analytic tools in order to understand exactly who your target audience is. Anyway, I'm barely scratching the surface here. I would highly recommend going to squarespace.com to start your free trial today. See if you like it, and I'm sure you will, and you can also go to squarespace.com/Mr. Nokia to get 10% off your first purchase. Thank you Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Alright, let's start with the design and build quality. This is a very easy win for the X30, with its metal and plastic combo versus plastic on plastic on the G60. But it's not just about the materials, it's about the attention to details. The X30 is a stunning device in person, with diamond cuts all around the device, a metallic camera plate, and two striking color options. I honestly can't decide which one I like best. It's definitely an attention grabber, and anybody who picks it up will immediately be able to tell that it's a pretty premium device. The X30 just feels more dense and more substantial in hand, which makes it appear more expensive. It also has an IP67 water and dust resistance rating versus IP52 on the G60, which means that the X30 will be able to withstand being completely submerged in water, while the G60 will just be able to resist splashes. And the glass protecting the display on the X30 is Gorilla Glass Victus, which is much more shatter resistant compared to Gorilla Glass 5 that's found on the G60. Now both of these devices are using recycled materials for their chassis, which is a nice touch. And I will give the G60 a bit of credit here for having an interesting design on its backplate, with tiny flakes that shine under light, which makes the device look a bit less boring. It's also easier to keep clean and a bit less slippery, so it wins when it comes to being a bit more practical. And you can see that focus on practicality with other aspects of the G60. As an example, it supports a micro SD card, so you can expand on the built-in memory if you need to. It also has a 3.5mm headphone jack, which means that you don't have to rely on Bluetooth wireless earbuds in order to enjoy listening to music. And its fingerprint reader, which is integrated into the power button on the right-hand side, is in my opinion more practical, though less fancy than the one built inside the display of the X30. In terms of speed, they're both identical, but it's nice to be able to reach that fingerprint scanner without having to look at the device. Just easier for muscle memory. So I think in terms of practicality, the G60 wins this one. Another interesting aspect is that both of these devices support an eSIM, but because the G60 is cheaper, that's a bit more impressive at this price point. Now when it comes to media consumption and watching stuff on your phone, they both trade punches. They both have sharp 1080p panels, but the X30 uses an AMOLED panel, so the colors pop out of the screen with an almost infinite contrast ratio and better viewing angles too. However, the G60 comes with a slightly larger display at 6.52 inches versus 6.43 inches on the X30. And LCD displays in general are just less straining on the eyes, especially if you plan on watching content for extended period of time. The G60 also comes with 120Hz refresh rate versus 90 on the X30. So putting them side by side, the G60's display definitely feels a bit smoother when you're just scrolling or even playing games. However, even though both devices use a single bottom firing speaker, the one on the X30 is of a much higher quality caliber. It gets much louder and sounds a lot more rich, and definitely feels like a much more premium speaker. The one on the G60 on the other hand is average at best. For me, the AMOLED AMOLED display with its striking colors and much higher quality loudspeaker makes me give the entertainment aspect to the X30. Now when it comes to performance, both devices have the same Snapdragon 695 5G chipset, clocked at 2.2 GHz. And as you'd expect, since both of them are running on stock Android 12, their performance is pretty much identical. I do have to say though that at this point in time, the software optimization on the G60 is actually a bit better than the one found on the X30. This is something that can be remedied with an update, but it's still an interesting observation. What's even more interesting is that, in my opinion, the performance of the G60 is probably its biggest selling point. For a device that costs just over $300, it's honestly superb. Of course, the fact that it's using stock Android 12 definitely helps it quite a bit, since it's a pretty lightweight operating system, but software optimization and the 120Hz refresh rate just make using the G60 a very pleasant experience. And because the G60 is using a plastic frame versus a metallic frame on the X30, plastic is better at heat insulation, which means that for prolonged use or heavy usage, it's also less likely to get warm than the X30. Though despite both devices being capable at running most of the popular games at decent graphical settings, I wouldn't buy either of them specifically for gaming. Now moving on to cameras, this is where the X30 has a huge advantage, similar to the one it also has with design and build quality. And that difference might not be very obvious if you just look at the key figures here. In fact, the G60 has a numerical advantage by featuring 4 cameras in total versus only 3 on the X30. But if you've been following me for a while, you'll understand that more doesn't necessarily mean better. So let's start with the main cameras. Both of these devices feature a 50 megapixel sensor. But of course, not every 50 megapixel sensor is created equally. The X30 sensor is just much bigger, and it also features optical image stabilization. Now, capturing images at a glance and in daylight, you won't really notice much of a difference really, except when it comes to color processing. And the G60 does a good job here by producing images that look pretty satisfying. But zooming in even just a little reveals how much more resolved details are captured by the X30's camera. And this difference between them becomes even bigger once you take both of them to capture low light images. There is simply no comparison here, as the X30 obliterates the G60 in low light. That includes how much more light it can capture, as well as the resolved details and sharpness. And even in video recording, even though both of them are limited to 1080p at 60 frames per second, the larger sensor on the X30 definitely captures better details. And with the ultra-wide cameras, it's a similar story. So you're talking about a 13 megapixel ultra-wide camera on the X30 versus a 5 megapixel ultra-wide on the G60, with a notably larger sensor on the X30 too. So ultra-wide images on the X30 are also much better in all lighting conditions. The extra camera on the G60 is a 2 megapixel depth sensor, and I can't really say that I've noticed that it offers any sort of very visible advantage really. And the imaging advantage also extends to the front-facing cameras. Yes, on paper the X30 has a 16 megapixel sensor versus an 8 megapixel sensor on the G60, but you have to understand that the X30 actually uses pixel binning, so it produces 4 megapixel images. On the other hand, the G60 produces full resolution 8 megapixel images. But despite the megapixel advantage when it comes to resolved details and processing, the X30 does a much better job here too. So overall, when it comes to imaging, the X30 is the better phone overall here, to nobody's surprise really. Okay, let's talk about battery life. The G60 comes with a 4500 milliamps battery versus a 4200 found on the X30. And that difference mainly has to do with the fact that the X30 is a much more compact smartphone. In mixed usage with 5G and Wi-Fi, I was getting about 7 hours on the X30 versus slightly over 8 on the G60. So there is a slight advantage for the bigger battery. With charging speed on the other hand, the X30 can reach up to 33 watts versus about 20 watts on the G60. I don't have the right type of charger to test out their speeds exactly to determine how much faster the X30 is, but an educated guess would be that the X30 would take just over 30% less time to fully charge its battery. Take from that what you will, but if I am aiming to get a device that will last me as long as possible on a single charge, my choice between these two would be the G60. Alright, so let's conclude. If I'm just looking at the practical aspects alone, I would easily pick the Nokia G60. Being bigger comes with its own set of advantages, such as having a bigger battery capacity, which also reflects in battery life, and a larger display. It also keeps the 3.5mm headphone jack and the micro SD slot if you want to expand on the memory. It's also significantly more affordable at around the $300 mark, which for some people will be enough to seal the deal. My favorite aspect about it is its performance for its price point, which is genuinely impressive. And I don't mean that that theoretically in benchmarks, I actually mean that practically, in how it behaves in day-to-day usage. That point alone makes it a very compelling device for the money. But for me as Abdullah, I usually go with heart. The X30's attention to design, build quality and imaging is what personally wins me over. I also like the fact that it's a bit more compact. It's also nice that almost every single element that's found on the X30 feels like a high quality one. From its loudspeaker to its display to all of its cameras. There's nothing found on the X30 that feels like it's been cheaply implemented. And this is something that it shares with far more expensive devices. It isn't afraid to trade punches with devices that are more expensive when it comes to its imaging capabilities, and it can proudly sit next to the best of them without actually looking out of place. By now you can tell that this is a device that I personally really like. I've also had more people asking me about the X30 than any other Nokia device that I've owned over the last 3 years. And that striking ice white color might have something to do with it. But most importantly for me is that the X30 comes pretty close to embodying that old Nokia spirit that I've been yearning for a very long time. Either way, understand what you want, and the decision between both of them should be pretty easy. Now I'll leave it to you. Which one of these two devices would you actually go for, and why? Share your thoughts in the comments down below. For my full detailed review of the Nokia X30, check out my video here, or check out my latest upload here. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to share, like, and subscribe to support the channel, and I shall see you in the next one.